experience of traveling in a snowstorm. I was living in Indiana at the time, and I was trying to drive from northwest Indiana across the northern part of the state to Fort Wayne, where I had meetings for church purposes. And as I was going along, it was snowing, and suddenly it whipped up into what is called whiteout conditions. Anybody ever heard that phrase, whiteout? Whiteout conditions means that the snow is blowing, and it's so heavy that you cannot see anything but snow. And suddenly, it literally was blowing along, blowing it off the ground, if you will, and blowing it across the highway such that I couldn't see the highway. It just looked like an ocean of snow. You could not see the lines in the highway. You could not see the sides of the highway. You couldn't see the fences or the fields nearby. It was just an ocean of snow in front of me. The only thing I could see were the lights of the semi in front of me. And so I just locked in, trying to stay exactly behind him, thinking, if he goes in the ditch, I'll follow him, but if not, we're both going to make it. It took me hours to get across the northern part of the state to Fort Wayne, and by the time I got there, I literally had to work to pry my fingers loose from the steering wheel. Have you ever white-knuckled it? You ever heard that phrase? I was squeezing so tight, it cramped my hands. But I did make it. I want to talk today to those of you who know what it's like to white-knuckle your way through life. Anybody else been there? We're getting through the heart of our mini-series that we've entitled Running with the Heroes of Faith. The theme verse comes out of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, which is the conclusion verse to everything was spoken in chapter 12. That's why it begins, therefore, based on everything that's been said that we've been studying. Therefore, since we are surrounded by this great crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off all the weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. The premise of our series has been the premise of this verse, which is that life is it's like a foot race. The life of faith is like a foot race. It takes training, absolutely. It takes endurance. You're not going to make it without it. But the good news is that you're not running that race alone. Not only do we have the family of faith into which the Lord has placed us here like this, but we also have this crowd of witnesses that have gone before us. That crowd consists of those men and women of faith who were ordinary people with their own struggles and their own faults and their own spiritual warts, to be honest. But each of them stuck with it. They endured, and because they did, they overcame by faith. And the whole point of the writer of Hebrews in sharing their testimonies is to teach us about that faith. He defines faith. Basically, faith, the definition we've been using in this series, is that faith is taking God at his word and trusting it'll be worth it. You know, there's a lot in that right there. Take God at his word. If he said it, I'll believe it. Sounds like, I think we sung something like that, right? If he said it, I'm going to believe it. Take him at his word and trust it will be worth it. And the writer of Hebrews says that it was that faith that not only enabled these men and women to endure their own white-knuckle moments of life, but it enabled them to overcome those challenges and difficulties. Just like it'll be that same faith that will enable us to overcome our struggles and challenges and hardships, no matter how deep this snowy slush that those challenges may be. So let's review real quickly. We've looked at the order in which they were brought to us. The first guy he mentioned was Abel, and he taught us about the sacrifice of faith. We looked at Enoch and the walk of faith, and Noah and the impact of faith, and Abraham and the obedience of faith, and Sarah and the abundance of faith, and Isaac and the legacy of faith. And I think most of those, almost all, are on our website if you want to go back and look at them. Because of the difficulties we've been having, not all of them have made it, but you can check them out. Last week we looked at Jacob in the struggle of faith. Oh boy, that was one that was, those brave, this cold last week found about the struggle. But today I'm going to invite out of the crowd our next witness of faith, and I'll tell you right up front, he is one of my all-time favorite characters of Scripture, Joseph. It might surprise you that, if you know much about Joseph in the Bible, that he gets just one verse in the book of Hebrews. You compare that to the fact that he gets 14 chapters in the book of Genesis, more than anybody else, any other character in Genesis, by the way. And when it comes to what the writer chooses to be the testimony of Joseph's faith, to me it's even more surprising. I mean, he could have chosen so many great moments and lessons from the life of Joseph. I mean, he could have chosen how Joseph's great-grandfather was Abraham, to whom God had made the promise of a land and a people and a blessing, and how that promise got passed along unbelievably to Abraham's son Isaac, who passed it down unintentionally to his son Jacob, who passed it down unexpectedly to his son Joseph. Or the writer of Hebrews could have chosen how Joseph was Jacob's favorite son and how that made him the least favorite sibling of his brothers. So much so that one day when Joseph showed up in his coat of many colors to see the other brothers, and all of a sudden those brothers looked at that favorite kid of their dad's, and they decided they were going to grab him, strip him of that coat, and throw him into a pit while they debated, do we kill him or do we sell him? And the selling group won the debate, and Joseph was sold down the river to slave traders while his brothers took his blood-soaked coat back to daddy and said, here's what must have happened to your favorite son. Or the writer of Hebrews could have told about how Joseph ended up as a slave and the captain of Egypt's armies, a guy named Potiphar, who had a wife whose name was Mrs. Potiphar, who looked at Joseph as a slave with benefits who needed to sleep with her, but how Joseph told her no way and ran away, which only caused her to accuse him of rape and get him thrown into prison. Or the writer could have chosen how Joseph somehow found favor with the jailer of that prison and his fellow prisoners, those prisoners who came to ask him to interpret their disturbing dreams. And now Joseph told them, now I can't do that, but God can. And so here's what God is saying, and it came to be just exactly what Joseph said. Or at least the writer could have chosen how Joseph's testimony, how one of those fellow prisoners, the one who kept his head, one of the fellow prisoners who just forgot about Joseph for 2 more years, but finally, when Pharaoh had a dream, the guy remembered and went to Pharaoh and told him about Joseph. And so Joseph was suddenly finding himself standing before Pharaoh and saying, listen, I cannot interpret dreams, but God can. And here's what he's telling you. Warning, 7 years of famine are going to hit right after 7 years of abundance, so you'd better get ready. And Pharaoh was so impressed that he promoted Joseph from the prison to the palace and put him in charge of Operation Feed Egypt. Or the writer of Hebrews could have at least told about the account where 10 years later after that, Joseph's brothers who had sold him into slavery showed up in Egypt to buy grain from the only place that had any, and they didn't recognize Joseph, who was there to receive them because he's in charge of the grain. And they didn't recognize him, but he recognized them. And overcome with emotion, he finally tells them, hey bros, it's me, Joseph. But don't worry. You did me wrong, but God took it and used it to do something really right, which is saving lives like he's doing for you. I mean, that was amazing. No anger, no outrage, no bitterness, no vengeance, no payback, just utter confidence that God was in control all along. That'd have been the story that I'd have told for Joseph's testimony in Hebrews. But that's not what the guy chose. When it came to the testimony of his faith, that got him inducted into the Hall of Fame, Faith Hall of Fame, here is what the writer of Hebrews chose to. He said, by faith, Joseph, when his end was near, he spoke confidently concerning the exodus of the people of Israel, and he gave orders specifically concerning his bones. Okay, anybody besides me read that and go, what? What kind of testimony is that? Well, because I got stuck inside because of the snow this week, I dug in and did my best to figure out what God might say, and I want to show you what he showed me about Joseph and the confidence of faith. Confidence, if I could define it for you, is assurance regardless of circumstances. That might help you understand everything I'm saying today. Confidence is assurance in spite of circumstances. The term confidence, by the way, if you didn't know it, literally means with faith. The prefix con means with, and fidens comes from fide, which is Latin for faith. And so confidence is the assurance, regardless of circumstances, that comes with faith. And I believe Joseph has something to teach us about that confidence of faith. So let's go back to his testimony, recorded here in Hebrews 11, and see what it can teach us. His testimony begins, by faith Joseph, when his end was near. The writer of Hebrews chose the final scene of Joseph's life as his testimony. That final scene of his life is recorded more fully in the book of Genesis, chapter 50. There we are told Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all of his father's family, and he lived 110 years. 110 years. It's a pretty good birthday last week, Dad, 88, but you're not 110 yet, okay? 110 years, and he saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also, the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on his knee, Joseph's knees. In other words, Joseph lived long enough to see his kids, his grandkids, his great-grandkids, and his great-great-grandkids. How's that? He was also blessed to have all of his brothers and all of their family around him in that moment. That is quite an end. Catch this. That is quite an end for a guy who never thought he'd live to see any family. Don't forget his story, which I think is the point that the writer of Hebrews is trying to make for us in choosing the closing scene of his life. Joseph did not get the life he expected. What he got was the presence of the Lord in his life. Please catch that. Joseph did not get the life he expected. Which of us ever does, by the way? Joseph did not get the life he expected, but what he did get was the presence of the Lord in his life. Let me explain that. One of the common elements that tie together all these people who have stepped out of the crowd of faith and testified to us, they didn't get the life they expected either. Not a one of them. Joseph certainly, maybe especially didn't. I mean, come on. He was hated by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was longly imprisoned. How's that for the life you didn't expect? And yet, interestingly enough, there's one statement that the Scripture keeps making over and over at each of those points in his life. Catch this. One statement it just keeps making over and over at each of those points in his life that were not what he expected. The Scripture kept using this statement, but the Lord was with Joseph. Well, this certainly wasn't what I expected, but the Lord was with Joseph. This was a terrible thing that happened to him, but the Lord was with Joseph. That's recorded 4 different times in the account of Joseph. From the pit to the pot to the prison. Though Joseph did not get the life he expected, he did get the presence of the Lord in his life. And I think that's what gave him the confidence of faith that held him all the way through to the very end. Joseph had confidence in God's presence. Get that down. Let me talk about it for a moment. Joseph had confidence in God's presence. The confidence of faith is based, folks, on the presence of God. That confidence, assurance, regardless of circumstances, is based on the presence of God. I think Joseph would put it this way. In my lowest points and in my highest points, I had to learn that the Lord was always with me. And when I learned it, it gave me confidence. Confidence to go on, confidence to look up, confidence not to quit, confidence to believe. It's just one of those things that I'm praying all of us will learn at some point, and maybe today could be the day. God's presence is still present, no matter what you're going through today. God's presence is still present. It may take us to the end of our days to learn that, but God is always with us in the good days and in the bad days, when we're on top and when we're in the pit, when we have it all and when we have nothing at all. God is always with us. God's presence is still present. I think that if Joseph were here, he'd say it this way. When I was lying in that pit with my brothers that they threw me in, you know what I discovered? I discovered that God was watching over me even when nobody was watching out for me. I learned that. I mean, they talked about killing me, but they didn't. Why was that? Because God was watching over me. Let the Lord speak that into your life today. God's watching over you even when nobody else is watching out for you. Or I think Joseph would say, you know, when I was in that pot and Mrs. Potiphar was hot on my heels as well as hot for other parts of me, I discovered the Lord is for me even when everyone else is against me. He is. He was on my side and gave me a way of escape from not just temptation, but from Mrs. Potiphar. So let that reality seep in your soul. The Lord is for you, even when everybody else is against you. Jesus steps in, folks, and everybody else steps out. Have you learned that yet? Jesus will always step in when everybody else steps out. And since Jesus is the all-time undefeated champion of the universe, you know what that means? You're going to win. That's what it means. So let that confidence build your soul. Add to that, I think Joseph would say. When I was in prison and I felt so forgotten, I discovered the Lord's working even when nothing's working. The Lord is working even when nothing is working. I thought I was forgotten. I thought it was over. Even the guy that got out I thought was going to do something for me, he forgot all about me. He forgot me. It was over. But God worked it all out. God still worked. It took a while. Boy, did it take a while. But God worked it out. And look at me now. Look at me now, he'd say at the end of his life. I'm surrounded not just by my brothers with whom I've reconciled, but also I'm surrounded by 4 generations of a family I never thought I'd have. The Lord's working even when nothing's working. I think I told you before that when I went to college, I drove the very worst car that was ever on the roads of this country. Yeah, my dad gave it to me. It was, well, I was going to say the brand. I don't want to get in trouble. But it was a hunk of junk. It was terrible. It burned out a valve on the way to college. I'm driving from Albuquerque to Oklahoma City. It burns out a valve in the way, and I still try to cripple it along. Because of that, if any of you know anything about cars, it was hard to start because it didn't have a lot of compression. And I would crank it, and finally get the thing going. And so I was working. I got a job working for a builder by the name of Phil Brown. I saw Phil a couple months ago. Still a wonderful man. I got a job working for Phil, and I tried that car. And I remember so many times he'd look at me as I was trying to leave, and I'd start to get that car started. He'd just shake his head looking at me in that car. And one day I had to call Phil up and say, Phil, it wouldn't start today. I'm not going to make it to work. What I'm going to do is I found out how much it's going to cost, and I don't have that much, but I'm going to walk down to the bank, which is just down the street from the college, and I'm going to see if I can get a loan. I don't even know how to do that, but that's what I'm going to have to do, Phil, because the car won't start. And so I walked across the street and down Highway 66, what it is. Anyhow, down the street until I got to Community Bank. I'll still remember this to the day. I told Phil about this 2 months ago. Walked in the bank. Guess who just happened to be standing there in the lobby? My boss, Phil Brown. And guess who he just happened to be talking to? The loan officer. And he just happened to say, hey, I want you to meet one of my employees, Russell. I don't know why he's here, but maybe you can help him. And then he left. And I walked out of that bank in just a few minutes with the loan necessary to pay for my car. And I looked at Phil in December and said, I know what you did. Thank you. God's working even when nothing was working. And he worked it out through a wonderful man named Phil Brown for me that day. I think Joseph did not get the life he expected, but what he got was the presence of the Lord in his life. And that's what gave him confidence, the confidence of faith that held him through to the end of his days. God's presence is still present regardless of the circumstances of your life or my life. So get this down, let it sink into your soul. When you get to the end of yourself, look for God, and you'll find he's been there all along. When you get to the end of it all, the end of yourself, the end of your rope, the end of whatever, the end of the road, look for God, and you're going to find out he's really been there all along. Even when life makes no sense, it still makes sense to God. There's an old saying that somebody finally made into a song. I love it. The statement goes, God's too good to be unkind, and God is too wise to be confused. When I cannot trace his hand, I can always trust his heart. And I've tried to do that in my life because let me tell you something. There's a lot of things I can't trace his hand because I don't get. But I can still trust his heart. Trust his heart. But just trust his heart because God is always there no matter how bad it gets or how good you've got it. God's presence is still present. So let the Lord witness that to you today. Now, go back to Joseph's testimony in Hebrews 11 because I want to show you something I think is even better than that, and I think that's pretty good. It says, by faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke confidently. There is that confidence. Spoke confidently concerning the exodus of the people of Israel. What's that about? Well, the Genesis account expounds a little bit more for us, where it says, then Joseph said to his brothers, he said to his brothers, listen, I'm about to die. I mean, he's 110 years old. He knew that. I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid. He's going to take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, Dad and Grandpa and great-grandpa. What's that all about? I think it's about confidence in God's promises. That's what I think it's about. God had promised Abraham that he would give him and his descendants a promised land. okay? And God repeated that promise to Isaac, and then he repeated it to Jacob, and then he repeated it to Joseph. So Joseph's facing his final days, and he just want to remind all of his family, listen, I don't want you to forget, we are not Egyptians, okay? This place is not our home. God promised us a promised land, and we're not there yet. I just want to remind you that. And don't forget, at the point at which he made that statement, this is really, really important. When Joseph made that statement to the people, his family, their circumstances in Egypt were great. I mean, they could not have had it better. Oh my goodness. They had plenty in a time of famine. They had no reason to even think about leaving Egypt. They were living the good life. But Joseph had learned something that I'm praying you'll learn. God's promises are still promises. God's promises are still promises, regardless of the circumstances of life. His promises are still promises. Regardless of how things look in your life, God's promises are still promises. You could say that Joseph learned that one the hard way. I mean, as a young boy, God had given him a dream. Remember that story? God gave him a dream and had promised Joseph that he would raise Joseph up. And for decades after that, it only looked like God was letting Joseph down. Joseph had to learn that the timetable of God's promises has little to do with our circumstances, good or bad. Did you catch that? God's timetable of his promises has little to do with our circumstances, whether they are good or bad. Don't forget this testimony came at the end of Joseph's life, surrounded by family, surrounded by abundance. It would have been easy to forget about the promise that God had given to his great-grandfather Abraham, not just to multiply the family, but to give them a promised land and make them a blessing to the world. It would have been easy to forget that because times were good. Life was easy. And just as easy to forget it then as it is in the bad times. But Joseph had learned about confidence in the promises of God. Joseph had learned that God's promises are still God's promises regardless of my circumstances. And it might take a while, Joseph would say, but God's promises never fail. God's promises are still promises, and he has promised us a promised land, he told his family. And it's not this land. So here's what I think God's trying to tell us. Here's what I got out of that as I was trying to figure it out. Always stand on the promises of God no matter where life takes you. Always stand on the promises of God no matter where life takes you. Don't let your perception of God be controlled by the circumstances of your life for better or for worse. The confidence of the eyes of faith is what enables us to see life through the lenses of God's promises and not through the lens of our circumstances, be they problems or prosperity. Now take a moment to just ask yourself this. Come on now, I really want you to ask yourself this. Will my life be ruled by my circumstances or by my confidence in God's promises? Am I going to let my emotions be ruled by my circumstances? Most of us, the answer would be, yeah, most of the time. God's saying, let them be ruled by my promises. Let your life be ruled by my promises, because when you stand on my promises, you will not fall for life circumstances. As I was recalling that whiteout storm thing I faced in Indiana, I was realizing, that's not the only storm that I have been besieged by when I was traveling. I remembered that one time Linda and the kids and I were coming back from Houston to Sherman, and we ran into a real frog strangler. You ever heard of a frog strangler? Anybody here ever heard of that? Sometimes they say toad strangler, which just tells you what kind of frogs they have. A frog strangler is a rainstorm that is so bad that it strangles and kills all the frogs because it floats them and drowns them, which would be really bad. But we were driving from Houston back to Sherman, and the rain came down not in drops but in sheets. You ever been there? All of a sudden, the rain was just pouring down so much so that I could not see the vehicles in front of me. The only thing I could see was that white line on the side of the road, and I could only barely see it. But this is what I understood about those white lines. They always mark the edge of the road. And if I could still see that line and stay inside that line and keep going, I'd get through this rainstorm. I just knew that. Linda kept going, maybe we should stop. I said, we'll get out of it sooner if we keep going. As long as I can see that line and keep going, we'll get through this. Now, folks, God's promises are like that line. They're constant. They're always there. Just stick with it, and it'll get you through. It'll get you through. Keep your eyes on the promises and keep moving, and God will get you through no matter where life takes you. Do you believe that? I just think there's some of you in this room, you're just going through something right now that you just can't see how you're going to get through it. Keep your eyes on the promises. Let your life be ruled by God's promises, not your circumstances. And keep going. Keep going. He's speaking to you today. Keep going. Now, that's not even the end of what Joseph taught me this week as I listened to his testimony. So let's go back one more time. Let me show you something I think is even better. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke confidently concerning the exodus of the people of Israel and gave orders specifically concerning his bones. Okay, there's a great comment. What in the world is that all about? By asking his family to take his bones out of Egypt and back to the promised land, Joseph was declaring, I may have lived and died in Egypt, but I'm not going to live or die an Egyptian. I may be living in a land of abundance, but this is not where I belong. So promise me. Promise me you're going to make sure that my bones are buried in the land of promise, the land where I belong. And again, Joseph gave instructions to his family at a time. He told them to do this when things were wonderful. They were in a good place. It was great. They had the favor of Pharaoh and the prosperity of the good life. And Joseph had worked hard to make it so. But Joseph had learned the hard way, how quickly and how easily circumstances can turn on a dime. That's why the final word of his testimony was about his confidence in God's best. Catch this. He's talking to us about his confidence in God's best. God had made him a promise. God had given Joseph a dream. And that promise was still the promise. And that dream was still the dream. That meant no matter how bad or how good they had it, God's best was still best. God's best was still best, and it was still, catch this, to come. God's best was still best, and it was still to come. God's best, listen, Joseph's saying, hear me here. When you head out for that promised land, and you will, I want you to promise me to take my bones with you because this place is not my home. God's best is still to come. And that's where I want my bones to rest, in God's best. You get that? By the way, that is exactly what they did with Joseph's bones, if you didn't know that. Book of Genesis actually closes with these words, the very last sentence in Genesis. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Then the book of Joshua closes with these words. The bones of Joseph, which the Israelites brought along with them when they left Egypt, were buried at Shechem, that plot of the promised land that had been allotted to the descendants of Joseph. That's the testimony of Joseph about the confidence of faith, folks. And here it is, that no matter how good things are today or how bad things get tomorrow, God's best is still to come. Please hear me. No matter how good things may be for you today or how bad they get tomorrow, God's best is still God's best. It's still the best, and it's still to come. God had given Joseph a dream. Life had given Joseph a nightmare. Absolutely. But Joseph held on to faith. He put his confidence in the presence of God, the promises of God, and the best of God. And that confidence is what gave Joseph his testimony. And that testimony can be summed up this way. When you take God at his word, you can rest your weary bones in the best of God's present promises. When you take God at his word, you can rest your weary bones in the best of God's present promises. My senior year, just before my senior year of high school, I was privileged to go to what was called the Nazarene World Youth Congress. There were a couple thousand of us that went. It was held in Estes Park, Colorado. Anybody here ever been to Estes Park, Colorado? Kind of a pretty place, isn't it? It's up in the mountains, and we're not talking hills. And I realize living here in Kansas, you might not have ever seen mountains, but it's mountains. And one of the things that they did with us while we were at that Congress was they took us on a hike to a nearby peak. I don't know what it was about that era that they just thought you take teens to camp, you get them out, and you take them on stress hikes, and God will do something for them. I think God is you're going to kill them is what is going to happen, and send them straight to see Jesus. But they take us on these stress hikes. And the thing was, I don't remember the name of the peak they took us to. The most famous around there is Long's Peak, but there are others like it that are 14,000-foot peaks. I didn't say 14-foot, which is all we have here in Kansas. 14,000-foot peaks there around Estes Park. So let me tell you what, this was not a stroll. This was a hike. And I want you to know there were some points along that hike that got really hard. I mean, it got really, really hard, and we were tempted to quit. But our guide just kept saying to us, listen, it's better higher up. It's better higher up. Come on, keep going. There were some points that we'd come around a corner, or we'd top an area, and I mean, it was beautiful. It was gorgeous. There were trees, there were lakes, there were incredible sights. It was beautiful, and we were tempted to stop and just stay there because it was so good. But the guide would say, don't stop. Keep going because it's better higher up. And let me tell you something. When we did reach that peak, it was better. It was incredible. I'll never forget this. The sights of just looking. You could see for miles and miles the wonderful grandeur and the beauty of God's creation. And it was so worth it. Can you hear my heart today? No matter how good you got it today or how bad you get it tomorrow, listen to me. God's best is still to come. I'm banking on that one. But to receive God's best, you got to receive God first. As we go to prayer, I want to give you an opportunity to receive Him, to let Him in your life, or ask Him back in your life because you've kind of gotten off track. Because to receive God's best, you got to receive God. If you've never asked Jesus into your life, I want to give you that opportunity, even now as we go to pray. So would you stand with me everywhere, please? Stand with me. Here's the deal. I want you to have a chance right now to talk to God no matter what you need to talk to God about. It might be some of the challenges you're facing. It might be the fact that you need to accept Jesus as your Savior this morning. It might be the fact that you don't even have a clue what you're going to do about this issue at work or this problem with the family. It might do with the fact that there's somebody sitting 3 rows away that's just driving you up a wall. Do you want names and numbers, by the way? We've all got issues, right? You got issues, I got issues, all God's children got issues. But we have a God who says, I can take care of it if you'll bring it to me. Everywhere in the Bible where you read about altars, like we have up here, these little wooden benches, everywhere we read about an altar was just a place to meet with God. And I always want these to be places you can meet with God. And right now I want you to meet with Him. Might be there where you're standing. Might be you need to sit down. You might want to come down, kneel at an altar. You might want to come sit in front of you. I don't care. Wherever you need to go to really make sure you connect with Him, I want you to do it right now because God's best is still best, and it's still to come. Lord, I am praying today for the folks in the room and on site who need to hear that confidence that you are still with us. Even when nothing seems to be with us. That your promises are still promises, no matter what the circumstances of our lives. And that the best really is still to come. That there will be a day. There will be a day when we see you face to face. And it will be worth it. So today, Lord, I pray over those who are gathered. You know their hearts, you know their struggles, you know their ups, their downs, you know the ones having the best days of their life and the ones that didn't think it could ever get this bad. Pray that somehow today you'll minister to their souls. Minister to their souls so they can rest their weary bones in your best for their lives. Father, I pray for that one or two or a few who, fact is, they're not going to receive your best until they receive you. And they know that they're not there. Oh, they may be in church, but they're not right with you. But today's the day they want to make it right. Help them to pray. They're in their own words, but something, a prayer like this. Jesus, I choose you today. Forgive me for trying to do it on my own. Forgive me for the messes I made. Forgive me for the sins I've committed. Forgive me. Save me, Jesus, and make me yours. I give my life to you. Father, for those who pray that way, I believe you're making all things new for them right now. And yes, Lord, I know that there are some in this place that they haven't been right with you for a while. Oh, they're Christians, but they just haven't been right. And they need to make it right today. So would you grant that they will simply pray, Lord, I'm coming home to you. I'm coming home to you. I don't want to live like an Egyptian. I'm going to trust you that the best is yet to come. So, Father, speak into their lives, move with grace, remind them to give thanks to you, God, for you are good. Your love and mercy never fail. So strengthen each one now today. Bless each one now today. Give confidence to each one now today, so that no matter what we face when we walk out of this place, good or bad, our faith will be in you and not our circumstances. Give us that confidence is what I pray. In Jesus' name. Amen.